Stop our own wave here. Today with this one right here. Do not buy Forspoken. Let's rate it.
Forspoken could have been something magical, a modern-day Second Son for a new generation.
Bro, Infamous Second Son was so great, man.
Instead, a sorcery's sister, waxing fantastic across the landscape that at times is arguably breathtaking, mysterious, and quizzical. Forspoken is a game so wanting in its comparisons to the contemporaries that it never feels like
this game just feels like it doesn't know what it wants to be.
Knows what it wants to be, or what it wants to do, or even at times where it is. Thanks to Square for the early review code. Forspoken starts out introducing you to Frey, an urban kid living in a crap hovel in New York City, in trouble with the law, smart mouth, running from bad decisions, and with a chip on her shoulder, the exact size of the writers need to make you feel just enough that you don't skip cutscenes. But you're not going to want to skip this review, because there's a lot to cover. Let's dive in. My brand is me, my sponsor's me, subscribe if you like it. The problems with the game's story starts right from the start. The start of the game has a short bit of narrative explaining her hardships, and then boom, she's in this fantasy world. And it's up to you.
Yeah, the intro wasn't too bad, but it wasn't too good either, so it was just like a 5 out of 10. Decent, at best.
You to uncover the mystery of why she was drawn there, and inevitably, how to get back home. To find her way out of trouble, Frey has to get into some, using her consistently droning...
The thing is, why does she want to go back home? Like, her life sucked. And now she got all those powers. Like, this is the perfect isekai where the main character just could get really OP and he would, like, be really cool about it. Like, why is she so mad about being in this world and wanting to return? That doesn't make any sense.
New companion, a magical amulet she wears.
If she had a good life in the real world, that's something else.
On her cuff that has to be one of the best examples of a character in a game talking endlessly but saying absolutely nothing. Nevertheless, with a magical cuff, Frey can cast spells, starting out with earth-based magics, and then learning more as she explores, levels up the spells she knows, and learns entirely new elements by killing the current rulers of the worlds, known as the Tantus. Her teleportation into the fantasy worlds hand-waved away from the very first moments, and only alluded to later on by consistent attempts to use the F-word in as many different ways as possible, like a YouTube explainer video.
Perhaps one of the most interesting words in the English language today is the word...
It never really captures the soul of the game itself. The novelty is almost completely wasted on this character who is consistently telling off everybody, telling everyone they don't want to learn more, they don't want to help more, they don't want to do anything, and they don't want to see more. This dissonance means that the player is then forced to somehow push through the main character's own dislike and general distaste for the world itself with their own emotions, splitting them away from playing as Frey and instead making them feel like they're pushing the story forward themselves. And that means the sense of wonder is almost entirely gone. And uneven and unlikable characters aren't unknown, but Frey could have been incredibly special. But the crux of modern writing that we see here, the character's general lack of care that exists far longer than is probable in the story, even after major world events impact those closest to her, it just becomes toothless. While some of this is fleshed out in the last half of the story and in small elements here and there, it's so unconnected and the mystery is just so nullified that it's like caring about a choice you made in 3rd grade that caused you to have to use a 12 set of colored crayons versus a 16. Nobody's going to care. And this is made even worse by the presentation, so filled with cutscenes, fades to black, and minutes of standing in place where the game refuses to let...
that has something to do with the engine. I've heard that this game engine is like horrendous.
You move when you're talking to Cuff, that engaging with it becomes this tantalizing Pavlov test of just how much you can wait to hit the skip button. We aren't talking a couple of times or a dozen times, but instead many dozens of times where this continued start and stop happens. It's unshakably weak in its delivery. Luckily, not all the presentation is this spotty, where almost all the games in this kind of genre hold back swift movement in the title until a later upgrade, hiding it like some kind of gaming petticoat. Forspoken says, screw it, and almost instantly Frey's blasting across the landscape, speeding across sand dunes, dashing through deserts, and later working through woods and wonders of final locations that make the starting couple of hours pale in comparison, and it's certainly something worth working through so you can see. The later sections have a couple of incredible moments of platforming, though Frey continues to control in this very loose fashion that can absolutely frustrate. The game's movement mechanics normally let the worst platformer get away with murder, though, here, moving across massive cliff faces, Frey's ability to parkour over damn near anything.
Yeah, it always looks better. So that's at least something.
Once you get to the Twilight locations and subdued glens later on and start blasting around the game world, it can look gorgeous. There's one particular location where I was running down a darkened valley, its ceiling almost touching like evil fingers in some prey-handed formation above me, and I actually was feeling like this is a moment in a game I will remember for a long time. Sadly, the game always has a problem. For example, its appearance when it comes to its resolution. First, you have 120 hertz settings as well as performance quality and ray tracing to mess around with on the PS5. And while some may look better than others, the game's overall dynamic resolution flits and flounders between high-resolution stopping points and Vaseline-smeared battles, where the main enemies you engage with the lower it drops, feeling like vision is an enemy. The game wants you to fight it, just as you're fighting these wayward zombie iguanas that you keep finding. It is mostly smooth. I say mostly because sometimes the game actually feels like its input is a little bit behind the movement of the character, and other times it feels perfectly solid, depending on pretty much something relatively unseen. I would also love to report on the PC version, but the availability of that review version is not here. Its specs recommend 32 gigs of memory. That does shine a light on some titles on PC, trying to figure out how to match the base-end consoles and their NVMe storage. But what's here, especially in the boring main city with its mostly stationary people, the odd resolution issues, and
the city feels so fucking soulless. It's insane. Well, those are just all standard NPCs, and you just don't give a shit about that. You know, like when they don't put care in anything. Okay, the buildings are good. Like I like Hellenic architecture. I can't speak, but that's it. The city has nothing for it.
A lack of truly magnificent
like
enemies.
Those soldiers, they look like those copy-pasted Black Desert Online soldiers. You know what I mean?
Design I'll talk about in a second. It makes you wonder, why does the system have such a problem with the resolution? Now, speaking of enemy design, it's ultimately a massive letdown from the break zombies, which are, well, pretty much zombies. No surprises in their attacks, movement, or presentation. The game's reliance on consistent animal enemies, finding yourself battling against bears and elk and wildcats, makes you wonder what's going to be left in this world if you extinct absolutely everything in the first place. Not all is lost, though. The human enemies are much more engaging to fight, and I found myself actually enjoying those battles.
I'll give it my best shot. You're mine.
In most games, humanoid ones are the best ones. Like
the reactions and the looks and the animations on Frey during battle. They are not perfect, but sometimes taking out that last enemy and seeing her grimace on her face from a hit slipping in is awesome and makes you actually feel a little bit of that pain. Or her double flipping out of the way of a magic spell, or feet lighting up like a mystical version of the Flash, and then dashing up the side of a building, leaping off, and peppering the enemy with rocks. And that brings us to combat parkour and the gameplay in general. Forspoken is a game that relishes in very loose combat behavior. As you collect spells, you can cast them with the right trigger, using the right bumper to slow down time, and choose between any elemental choices that connect to the spell type, and using digital pad to switch between the magic types once you unlock more. Locking onto enemies and bursting around them in Frey's parkour style is awesome, not going to lie there. It can be very enjoyable, but the first set of skills and magic is not a great way to introduce players to her powers, especially depending on where you are. Some of the enemies will be resistant to those first spells, so taking them out is like throwing pebbles at a train and expecting to derail it. They're nature-based, and many are ranged, with ranged power-ups as well from holding the trigger. But with moving enemies, flying enemies, a lock-on that doesn't always switch from your most recent foe to the new one unless it just randomly wants to, and super weak spells at first, it feels almost boring. Your first
there's not a button to change auto-lock targets?
Spells are, no kidding, 3 types of rock: fast rock, slow rock, or scattered rock like a shotgun. Johnny Appleseed in a plant into the ground so it can throw pebbles at a buzzard is about as fun as it sounds, and less engaging than I'm explaining it. Once you power those up by performing particular acts,
like something that stationary is never good, especially for a game like this,
in the world or events, or just running around, you can find mana. You can start to mix and match, dropping those plants down, throwing rocks at enemies, and then later mixing in fire, summoning spectral fire zombies, swords, or calling down a water spout to suck up enemies, and later even more. You can upgrade your fingernails to add bonuses to your abilities, find new cloaks, and outfit them with skill perks and a couple other items. But like a lot about Forsaken, it never feels fleshed out. Adding bonuses to items is locked down to those that you found in the game world, with questionable percentage bonuses to abilities that aren't the clearest in their verbiage in the first place, so that upgrading and switching out items becomes more of just casual experimentation versus true augmentation. Mixing all those together with a very generous, in fact, possibly too generous parry system is not really as enjoyable as I was hoping it was. It still looks cool at times and certainly over the top, but it doesn't feel tight. In many ways, this is exactly what I wanted in a spell system that grows in power over time. However, the first spells really are so bland in their introduction that by the time you get to the next set, you almost don't want to use those original ones at all because the new ones feel so much better. It's almost like a different system entirely. Unfortunately, you may have to switch because of enemy
but
resistance.
isn't that like part of the evolution? Like that you are going to use the better ones instead of the worse ones? This is a big problem like every game has, I think.
Gaining movement powers, taking on challenges to upgrade your initial spells, all that would add complexity at the very least to a lot of the common elements that we see in these kind of games. Especially later, Forspoken can be a good deal of fun while doing that. Switching out between the different elements, watching their cooldown timers. But oddly enough, Forspoken has so many spells that you can easily find yourself leaping into the switch menu, changing that skill, going back, casting that, changing another, going back, casting that, changing another, going back and casting that again and again and again. That menu system really never comes together. You do have 3 different difficulty settings that you can choose, and you can change them on the fly whenever you want to. Additionally, like a lot of the titles we've seen lately, accessibility is the name of the game here. They do have a ton of options that you can switch and change to make sure that the game feels right pretty much for you. Feeling right is not something that happens with the voice, though. First, voice acting from the characters themselves is a bit hit and miss. The NPCs are a mix of characters and stereotypes that you may or may not like. The strange-sounding guide that tries to befriend you with a tour around the city and still likes you even though you just told him to F off at least 5 times in 30 seconds. To the crazy pants main boss. Each one is an archetype, for example, strength or, well, craziness, with a character talking to herself back and forth in cutscenes
too stereotypical
that last entirely too long, and entire missed swaths of characters talking where you just want to skip to the end so you can battle them. Frey's lack of character and the delivery really lacking any gravitas means that it never gets off the ground. And while the talking between Cuff and Frey has been dissected to the point that even the skeleton of a discussion is broken down into 1,000 bits, I can say it wasn't that bothersome at all. You can turn the frequency up and down, but honestly, I tuned it out. That could also be because of this next issue. One problem that we see is talking about modernization of language in fantasy games. Writing modern language for a game can be an amazing achievement or wholly miss the mark. It's quite difficult. If a game's design takes, let's say, 4 to 6 years to make the game and record all of that audio, then during the original writing and recording, something that sounded modern can sound positively archaic. Forspoken tries to get away with most of this by the consistent use of the F word. It just replaces everything. And in a way that actually works, but it also loses impact about 20% of the way through the game, and you're still stuck with another 25 hours.
Yeah, but it's still something you need to experience for yourself, and it's something you need to decide for yourself, if it's good or not.
Go. The best voice acting in the game is by all means Frey, but the writing really never lets her stretch her wings in any way, shape, or form. Now, one place that the game is actually lifted up are the musical tracks, and I want to make sure that that's explained. Exploration for musical tracks is awesome, but only later does the game really experiment with any kind of soundscape that you will be surprised by. It's not terrible at the starting, but it is fairly generic, and then really ends up coming into its own later on in the game. However, the timing for stingers, surprises, and battle queuing is way off. A lot of the times while exploring and entering into battle, the battle music won't trigger, and it just plays the exploration music throughout it all, offering no real emotional investment, or stingers timing shooting out after the actual moment it should, offering a really comedic timing to the surprises. This is a perfect example of excellent music that just needs the timing tightened down for everything to feel emotionally connected and resonate at least a little bit. Sounds are fine, I dig them. Explosions, fiery burning, churning up a muddy quagmire of dirty water into a cyclone around enemies' feet is tactile, sounds great.
Something expected for $70.
And is exactly what you would expect.
Like, the price is insane. I would bet much money for that game. Wait for a sale at least.
3D audio works. It's rewarding. You can track enemies regardless if they're on screen or not. Frey's ability to move around at such high speeds can make panning and tracking a bit less useful, but working through all these different enemies and running around, that's a trade-off I can live with. But that's the problem with Forspoken. Everything's a trade-off. For example, the game has horrible map mess. This easily equals some of the complaints that we see about Ubisoft games. You can see mana for raising your spell abilities just laying around the game world, which means for the most part, you're going to want to try to find it all because that does help you. But they're everywhere on the map, and it shows them all. It also shows all the places to go and fight a single group of enemies to get
okay, a big Ubisoft problem as well. Like, this is insane. Why do you do this? Like, the sense of exploration is like completely gone with that shit.
Note about the game world. The smallest things are tracked here, and it's not hundreds, it's thousands. And while the level design in the first couple locations you go to aren't the greatest, it does get better later on. And like I said, those are some enjoyable explorations. But with that loose story and a character that's tied to it that just doesn't want to seem to engage it, as well as the presentation problems, Forspoken has a lot of issues. How does all this come together, though? Is there any fun factor to be found? There is. Forspoken has its fun. It's just locked in a head-to-head battle with a sense of almost confusion. There's moments later on with the spells, ignoring the main story and exploring and combat that are absolutely awesome. But the game has two huge core weaknesses. The first is that the game consistently feels like it wants to be a game like Horizon Zero Dawn, but it's lacking the one thing that worked so well in that other game. The connective tissue between the unique world and the character. It was woven into the combat and the collection. The surprise of finding new enemies and having to take them apart in different ways. In Forspoken, there's almost none of that, and the enemies are nothing more than mindless roving packs of creatures that never challenge the player and just eject boring bits onto the ground. The other is that the game feels so messy. Here's just one of a countless example I can give. One of the first quests you get is a side quest. You find a statue, basically a kid's toy, and it goes on to say how rare and valuable they are, how much of a find it is. It's 10 feet away from...
Yeah, this game in total feels like there were multiple teams who did all those different things and like actually tried to do something about that part, but it doesn't connect well together, you know? Like, it's not like it was made by one team or one company.
From 5 characters talking in a group in a city square. If a pattern is established by that first trackable sign in any system, that feels far too soon to establish it. But it does. Everything feels ramshackle. Even the later locations, which do look and feel much better than the starting 5 hours, feel like everything is sort of plopped down in the game world. The destructive force, almost like the nothing in the never-ending story, is turning everyone to zombies. But it doesn't seem like it should restructure the entire world like geomodders in a Minecraft competition. I did enjoy myself, but the similarities, both in gameplay as well as appearance to Second Son, were noticeable and unshakable. The movement, the over-the-top animations, the glitz, the almost hallucinogenic dance club vibes win in battle. What results is this glorious overwrought work of messy art, color, and grandeur, and almost monolithic display as spells and moves explode around one another, like the developer just learned what a graphics shader was. Games always hope to subsume the title genre contemporaries.
Bro, but I like this style of combat. I hope more games try to do it like in that way, but like that's the good part, and everything else is not. That's a problem.
Thanks, and build upon
like I want a new Infamous Second Son. That just said
own. Borrowing tactics like great builders borrow philosophies and materials to make something from the foundation of what came before and yet end up something unique.
You know.
Forspoken doesn't. So as you guys know, I rate games on a buy, wait for a sale, rent, or never touch it again rating scale. Forspoken is the very reason the full 1 to 10 scale in game reviews need to actually be used if you're forced to use numbers in the first place, which makes about as much sense as Forspoken does, which means barely any. I would say wait for a deep, deep sale on this. If you can turn off your brain, there's some enjoyment to be had. There are fun moments in the game, and I expect no end of people spending 3 to 4 hours in it and thinking it's fun, but the curve of enjoyment turns into a deep dive really quickly. The game is for people who just want to run around, pick up some items, and fight some random animals. It's just an odd game from start to finish. What would have made Forspoken more enjoyable, though? First, I'd say the spell types. They really need improvement in the first part of the game. The enemy design could have seen massive improvements with more human-type enemies. Even though they show up in the game, they're never nearly as prominent as they probably should be. Also, Frey's attitude, which could have been a fish out of water, instead resolves down to this pissy teenager that has to go with their parents to somewhere they don't want to go. But it's for the entire game. Lastly, Forspoken's delivery of information
so
many
there's
times...
no character development.
are stop-gap moments, waiting for Frey to be able to move, because apparently listening to Cuff requires every bit of mental power that she has, so she can't move. Having that ability to just move around during those parts would have gone a long ways. Follow me on Twitter. Check out the Patreon if I've saved you any money or warned you away from a bad game. I hope you enjoy whatever titles.
Good video. Is anything? But yeah, that's it. This game is totally not worth it. Like, we're gonna wait. Maybe we're gonna update this one. And yeah, that's actually it. I hope you liked it. And go subscribe to ACG. He did the content. I just reacted to it. And I would really appreciate your support as well. If you want to. Like, maybe comment, like, sub, you know? The normal ordeal. And I guess that's it. I guess see you next time. Wafer.